Hello?
Hello?
Hello? I think we're there. Okay, great. Well, I don't know how many of you were in the session on global sustainability a minute ago over here. It was a great prelude to this. This is basically a slightly more granular look at the same question. That was civilization and the planet. This is climate and civilization. And you've seen the bios. So I'm going to try, especially because we're running a little behind, I want to save time on that. But sitting next to me is Graciela Chichilinsky, who has so many aspects to her resume that I really want you to read it. Everything from catastrophic risk planning and management to a company that could there are several efforts to draw CO2 out of the air. We seem to be really good at putting it into the air. So far, we're not very good about finding ways affordably to pull it out of the air and limit our impact on the system that way. So please just dig in on her links, and you'll find out more. Berto, now how do you like to? You said earlier, how do you like to say your name, your first name? Heriberto.
Heriberto.
Yeah, but if you roll the R, I guess I'll try to roll the R. Heriberto Cabezas, who again has an amazing resume, is doing remarkable things on modeling trajectories, possible futures for how we get through this, not just this century, but the next 2 centuries. Is there a soft landing that leaves us with a planet that that whoever's alive at that time will credit us with saving more than we might think is possible right now? And at the far end, Peter deMenocal is a professor at the Earth Observatory, Lamont Doherty up the Hudson River. Wonderful place to visit if you ever get a chance, just over the George Washington Bridge and turn north, and it's pretty much right there. And he's also been involved in not just the climate science, but in testing these interfaces between what science says and what the rest of us decide to do or not do about this picture. And the context that came up a minute ago in the others, across the room here was the papal visit. He's coming to the States. He has this remarkable document. I have a piece coming sometime tonight, if I finish writing it, about aspects of the message. I was at the Vatican in 2014 for a 4-day meeting of scientists and philosophers and economists and sociologists and theologians and people from the church. That was called Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Planet, Our Choice. And so again, between the data and the values of all of us, the variegated values around the world, we have to figure out there's choices to make. And that wasn't always the case with human history. This is the climate and civilization part. In human history, we didn't have a global picture until very recently. So we didn't have that context. We were talking a minute ago in the other room about there's a presumption that now we can see the global picture. What knobs can we manipulate in society through finance, through access to education, through regulation, through fees, to limit the adverse consequences? So, Peter, do you want to start out? Thought if you could just give a very brief kind of. I assume here everyone knows the basics of climate science. We'll find out. But could you just sort of give your crystalline sense of your own sense of that interface between what we know through science and what you see happening or not happening in the rest of the world?
Sure. I mean, that's an hour unto itself, but I'll be very, very short. In a nutshell, climate is changing much faster than our ability to understand it, and that is having ramifications really all around the planet. It's something that we're seeing happening this year. Any of you have been monitoring how the planet's temperature has been evolving this year? This is by far the warmest year ever recorded. Even if the rest of the months from now on were to be the same as has been historically, it's a 97% chance it's going to be the warmest year ever measured. It's off the charts. Some of that's due to El Nino, a lot of it's due to us. But the larger implication is that the way that climate change matters to civilization, in my opinion, is its impact on the things that matter to us. None of us, I'll speak for myself, but even as a climate scientist, we don't really care about global mean temperature. That's not what we live. We don't live the average, we live the extremes. And so how climate impacts humanity is through its sort of many-headed hydra impacts on food security, on water security, on the security of our shelter, and also the stability of our political systems, of our systems that sort of keep us all friendly with one another. And those are really the pressure points, actually, that Heriberto had mentioned during his presentation just earlier. I think that's really the action point, really the razor's edge where climate matters to people, is through those really very simple and very finite number of pressure points. And if you look at the history of how climate has impacted humanity, going back into prehistory, but actually with the Syrian conflict even right now, there's a climate hand in most of the upheavals in society and civilization as you go back through humanity. So it rings true for any historian of human behavior that climate plays a role, sometimes not the dominant one, but it's a contributor.
Yeah, and so Heriberto, we were talking about knobs, manipulability, and the fact you were saying that the one thing that's unique about the climate problem is it's one of the true globalization realities. The economy links us through trade now, and climate links us because the molecule of CO2 from a power plant in Beijing or from a taxi cab in a traffic jam in Boston, the atmosphere doesn't know the difference. It's a well-mixed gases, right? So, you know, can you build on what you were saying before? You said that the real challenges seem to not be, there are trajectories that are possible, but how can you model or sort of find out how, given what you know about how we work and about the divisions on the world, the fact that a bunch of us have had our fossil fuel party, our little 100-year, 200-year party, and a bunch haven't yet. Where would you work first to sort of find the right knobs?
I think at the global level it's a difficult problem because we are still trying to develop the institutions that could be used to turn knobs at the global level. At the national levels, we can do it with a certain amount of effort and discourse. But at the global level, we have the Montreal protocols on the fluorocarbons, but that was a relatively simple problem. Right. Climate, energy, CO2 emissions, it's tougher because the energy is heavily dependent on, the economy is heavily dependent on energy. So it's a difficult problem. I'd like to abuse your patience by following up in something that Peter said. Yes, historically, if you plot known upheavals in civilization, there seems to be a correlation with climate changes, prolonged droughts, and things like that. And what changes in the environment, including climate change, do, I don't know that they necessarily cause an upheaval, but they limit the operating space that you are dealing with. In other words, if you have a drought, you now have a lot less food to work with. So the latitude you have to do what you have to do shrinks. And if you have a society that also has any other problems, these things can build up, and that's how you get an upheaval. There is the geographic theory of upheavals. Jared Diamond is the main proponent of this. There's another one that says, well, it's not just geography, it's also the internal dynamics of a society. I think both are important. And climate, just anything like that, just limits the latitude you have to operate.
Of course, this is where you get one of the paradoxes. 2007, in the New York Times, we did a big package of stories called The Climate Divide, in which we said, basically, if you're rich and technologically capable, you can insulate yourself from much of the, at least for the next 50 years, what is seen as climate vulnerability. We have crop insurance, so farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, even that isn't there. We have, in Australia, we wrote about, Perth, Australia was building they built a solar-powered water desalination plant. And that was the thing that got my attention. Wow, look at that. If you have wealth and technology, you can turn wind into drinking water, basically. And so that divide, you know, if you look at this problem more as a climate vulnerability problem and an energy problem, it becomes just get rich. It's kind of the answer. And of course, that's the paradox. It leads to other issues if you don't control where you get the energy from. You've worked on this from just about every vantage point. And Graciela, I don't know if you want to, I assume it's one of the things that's led you to global thermostat, to sort of some other solutions that are, maybe we aren't going to get the CO2 regulation problem right. Is that one thing that leads you to say, let's find a technology for getting this gas out of the air at scale?
Well, even if we get the regulation right, we still have to do it.
Yeah.
So the technology removes the CO2 that the regulation will force us to do, let's say. So the regulation doesn't suffice. You also have to physically get a way to do it. Global thermostat was invented, and the technology I co-invented and patented and is operating now commercially is precisely to remove CO2 from air and make it into profitable commercial products, which I call it, it's a technology to take CO2 from air and make it into cash. And the idea is that it doesn't depend on regulation. Because if you make something into cash, you depend more on Adam Smith profit motive than on regulation. And it's working. And amazingly now, scientists are converging, and the IPCC has documented on page 191 of the fifth assessment report, which I can send to anybody here, that without removing CO2 from the atmosphere in massive quantities, we won't be able to prevent catastrophic climate change, that reducing emission no longer suffices. So we are right there. I knew it because I was the US lead author for the IPCC. That's why I started Global Thermostat. But we're right there where it's needed. Yet that's not as detailed as it is and granular as you wanted us to be. That's not the solution. That's a solution at the engineering level, and it's critical so that even the rich countries don't suffer. Forget about the poor that suffer most. But the rich countries, like the United States, would suffer from having three, what was the name of our big superstorms? Sandy.
Yeah.
If we had 5 Sandys a year, New York will close down. We already had one, but the characteristic of climate change is that it makes these events, catastrophic events, more frequent and more volatile and worse in every way. So the way I like to think is that you can get 5 Sandy superstorms every year. So if you think about that, we are very rich. But even New York City, rich New York City, we will be out of action for most of the year, and we would not operate. And that is what climate change is about. The OECD computed trillions of dollars of losses just in Miami, 3 trillion in fact, from climate change. And the next one is Shanghai with 2.3 trillion in losses. So even the rich are not exempt. And I don't want to talk about the poor because it's terrible. But in a granular way, what do we do? There is something to do, very granular. Make a list of the things we need to survive as a species. We need air. Without air, we cannot survive for more than a few minutes. We need water. Without water, we cannot survive for more than a few days. We need food. Without food, we cannot survive for more than a few weeks or months. So air, water, food. This is not complicated. Air. We are putting at risk the atmosphere, where the air is from. We need to put limits on our use of the atmosphere. That's what the Kyoto Protocol did. And the trading through the carbon market that I designed and wrote into the protocol in 1997 was not designed to make money. Although it made $250 billion trading, in the carbon market in 2011, and is now spreading through 4 continents. But the idea was to put those limits. We need to put limits on the amount of CO2 that we put in the atmosphere, and that's what the Kyoto Protocol did. In December, those limits expired. Not the protocol, it's law, but the limits expire. So we need to extend those limits. But we need to do the same thing about water that we do with air and about food. Water, the oceans. We are destroying the oceans, which are the source of life on this planet. We need to put a limit. We need a blue market that will start by putting limits on the biomass that we extract from the sea, 75% of which we throw away, perversely, cruelly, and destructively. So we need a blue market along with a carbon market to help with the atmosphere and the oceans. Biodiversity. Biodiversity in the oceans is threatened by the additional acidification because the oceans extract 70% of the CO2 that the Earth produces. So the more CO2 is produced, the more the oceans acidify. And all those creatures, crustaceans, which are at the bottom of the food chain, because that's what whales eat, they have their skeletons, which are outside, destroyed, like the corals are destroyed because of the acidification. So we need to put a limit, like we did in the Kyoto Protocol carbon market, limit on the amount that we extract from the seas and the amount that we throw away. And then let the nations trade and come up with a price, because the price has a helpful sense of direction. And finally, biodiversity, of which we are part. We need to put a limit, nation by nation, on the amount of biomass that we destroy, on the amount of biodiversity that we destroy. 3 global markets. One exists, the global carbon market, the blue market for the oceans. Generally speaking, we need a water market. It's already coming up in various ways, and a biodiversity market. Not because markets are so great, they are, but that's not the reason. The reason to do that is because to have a market, you start by limiting, nation by nation, the usage and the misuse of these 3 materials or inputs that we desperately need for the human species to survive: water, air, food.
So I've got to get some reactions from both of you on this. The market solution, there's been some pretty big limits that have been sort of materialized the last few years. Even Kyoto is not the model that you'll see in the Paris Agreement going forward. So, but just on some of these other points, Peter, do you want to just?
Well, I think Graciela is fundamentally right. That I think, when you come down to what does it take for humanity to survive and thrive, it comes down to some very simple, fundamental entities: food, water, shelter, energy. Those are all things that we can quantify and we can measure. I think it's hard to envision a global treaty on that, mainly because there are very leaky systems already. But I think trying to use market forces to affect change is fundamentally true. I think that we can say all that we want in the scientific community about our observations about how the world is changing, but really that's an echo chamber, and we haven't done ourselves a very good service by talking amongst ourselves. Really, the conversation needs to be at least bilateral with business and finance, and I think that's really the agent of change. Is not so much what I say as a climate scientist, but how I'm able to talk to Graciela and her contingent and instill change in the economic systems and corporate behaviors. I think that's really where the rubber meets the road, and that's something that actually we have a new Center for Climate and Life at Columbia University that I direct, and that's really the essence of what we're trying to do, is to build these partnerships between scientists who sort of have an idea of what the path forward is going to be, and then how that impacts corporate and financial interests.
So this is a perfect segue to you, because I just want to say something that you said earlier, just quote you from one of the notes I took. What's lacking, you said, why isn't this happening? You had the formula that basically articulated a lot of what you just heard about tweaking things and making the world better. You said we lack a cultural narrative that says sustainability is really important. We have a cultural narrative that says murder is wrong, but we don't have a cultural narrative that says managing our planet in a way that allows us to live on it as long as we want is important. And that's not very scientific, but everything I've done, 30 years of examining these questions as a journalist, to me it comes back to that as well. So what do you see possible on that front?
Well,
in other words, all of these things, these pricing mechanisms, the value we put in something is a function of values. So anyway.
Let me offer two thoughts here. One of them is that being rich offers you limited insulation from environmental changes like climate change. In the short term, yes, you can partially insulate yourself. Longer term, you cannot. Okay, it comes home to roost at some point. The other thing is you have to be careful with markets. And let me be counter something here. This is a water bottle. It's a three-dimensional object. I can actually open it and have a drink. And if I were to somehow project this three-dimensional object into one dimension, I would have trouble having a drink from it. I don't know what a water bottle in one dimension really looks like. So when you project something as complex as the environment onto money, one dimension, is like projecting my water bottle into one dimension. You lose a lot of information. And what happens then is you are doing a two-way projection. You are projecting from the real object to money, and then you are projecting back from money to the real object, and you lose information every time you do this. So markets are useful, but I am not sure that they are the ultimate answers. I think you have to use markets in the context of cultural values and a cultural narrative which set the playing field where the market operates. If you just throw a market into
but you have to start from limits.
If you throw a market into the wrong playing field, you can easily end up with perverse results. You see, you meet the requirements, but there is something wrong. It's kind of, I won't use that analogy, but so you have to couple it. You have to couple it. And I'm not saying don't use markets, just use markets, but understand that they have to be coupled.
Yes, right. But you start from limits on the use, physical limits that the scientists find: water, air, food, biodiversity, water sources, and the atmosphere. They start from limits. The only good thing about markets is that they force you to start from limits. So the limits are what you were talking about. Limits half an hour ago.
The
limits are critical.
Markets distribute a scarce resource. That's what they do according to money. Right. And all I'm saying is I'm just raising a note of caution that distributing a complex scarce resource according to money has to be done very carefully, because unless you are doing it in the right context of cultural values, it's not going to work well.
Definitely.
Well, this gets back to the idea of the educated consumer. In other words, I've written about a number of examples, some of them involving, like Greenpeace a number of years ago, when it got into identifying the pulp and paper impacts on the Indonesian forests, and also on the palm oil impacts of palm oil, which was a biofuel and is in every candy bar and a lot of cosmetics. And if you get it from the wrong places, you're destroying orangutan habitat. And they did this kind of bifurcated education effort where they had people in the field in Indonesia revealing the impacts. Then they had very creative communicators create YouTube videos to tell young people in Europe that when you eat a Kit Kat bar, you're essentially eating an orangutan. and the pinchers, that created pressure on Nestle to run to a more sort of mainstream environmental group and say, hey, we need to get control of our supply chains. And so information, and this environment we are in now for information, communication is my arena, seems to be an exciting, give us exciting prospects for having the consumer of energy or of palm oil or whatever, having more of a transparent sense of where that's coming from. There's huge untapped potential there. It's just beginning to be demonstrated. So I don't know if any of you want to jump in on the role. And this is different than classroom education. It's just access to information. So when you're looking at a product on the shelf, you have, or you scan it with your device, you have some sense of where it came from.
To be honest, we basically depend on people like you to help us create the necessary cultural narrative. Because
throw the ball at you.
I don't know how to do it. You see, I have an enormous whiteboard in my office full of mathematical equations. This is what I know how to do.
Yeah.
But how do you communicate something in a manner that helps create a cultural narrative? It's something that people like you need to do, because I wouldn't know how to do it.
And it's very important.
And it's very important.
Although yes. I will say, it depends on how you define me. If you define me as a journalist, forget about it. If you define me as a professor who teaches, my title at Pace University is Senior Fellow for Environmental Understanding. Most of the students I teach are not going to be journalists. They're going to be communicators for a company or for whatever. But I'm trying to imbue them with the idea that, as Greenpeace that demonstrated, you don't need to be me anymore to do this, meaning me, the New York Times. Anyone with a camera and a good idea, or with the ability to visualize data in a new, novel way, or to create a meme that goes around Facebook and isn't just about cute animals, you can kind of have an impact in this arena that is unprecedented. Universities have a responsibility to get directly involved in communicating. Companies as well, obviously for their own self-interest. But tell your own story is the future, more than write a letter to email a reporter at the New York Times and say, hey, can you come here and interview me?
But the point is that communicators are extremely important, so that everybody can participate the way you explained. And scientists are sitting here, and you are the only one which is in the communication area. And you are playing a crucial role, because the science is so new and it's confusing. And we need everybody involved. And when you change values, that means values for everybody, not for the scientists. Who cares about the scientists' values? The values of all of us.
And there's one thing that's related to this I wanted to bring up. Some of you may have seen the coverage the last few days of a whole new history of Exxon's understanding of climate change came out through the work of Inside Climate News, which is a pretty good example. That entity is a new example of, it's not the New York Times, yet 3 years ago they won a Pulitzer Prize. It was created by a nonprofit, it's a nonprofit journalistic enterprise it had 2 people originally, and now it's put out this trove of documents on Exxon. There's this, and this gets at corporate culture or the culture isn't just at the consumer end. Within companies, cultural changes can matter. In 1978, a scientist at Exxon wrote this memo. I'm just going to quote a tiny bit. He said when they were understanding that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, you burn a lot of fossil fuels, you end up changing the climate in big ways. And he said, this is Weinberg. He says, you just Google for Weinberg and Exxon and Inside Climate, you'll find it. These are some grandiose thoughts. This was a memo up the Exxon chain on what we, Exxon, might undertake to do in connection with the CO2 problem. I propose Exxon to be the initiator of a worldwide CO2 in the atmosphere R&D program, along with the lines of the International Geophysical Year. This is 1978. This is Exxon. That may be the kind of opportunity we're looking for, to have Exxon technology, management, leadership, resources put into the context of a project aimed at benefiting mankind. What would be more appropriate than for the world's leading energy company and leading oil company to take the lead in trying to define whether a long-term CO2 problem exists, and if so, what countermeasures would be appropriate.
He wrote that in 78?
1978.
Well, what do you say?
What do I say?
Yes.
Well, I'm actually haven't written the piece yet, but I had this thought over the weekend. I wrote a piece initially about just the news, that, hey, this is kind of like, to me, the thing Exxon could bring to the table now, going forward. I mean, you could spend the next 10 years yelling at Exxon, like many environmental groups do. You know, oh, shame on you, which is perhaps appropriate. Or you could say, hey, you know, Exxon, there are people like Graciela out there who have some bright ideas. Maybe Exxon can put some of its tiny, 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 tiny R&D budget into helping facilitate that problem. Scalable, direct capture, and removal of CO2.
Communicate it.
That's my,
and your students.
It's my next story, basically. Once I'm through with the Pope this week.
Where is that story coming out?
This one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Whenever I get done with everything else that I'm working on. The next few days. So anyway, but I think, you know, there are ways to think about where's the money, where's the initiative, where are the opportunities. We know that CO2 removal is not the solution, as you were all saying. It's a multi-pronged, it's a silver buckshot thing, as Bill McKibben said long ago, not a silver bullet challenge. So, so Peter, again, I don't know if you read those things, but corporate culture is a really important question, and one assumes that, well, the divestment movement is sort of getting out of those companies in a way, but some people argue you should get into the company as a young person and change the culture. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been giving it more and more thought, mainly because I've been watching this climate problem, if you will, unfold for a long time and been frustrated as a scientist that we as scientists tend to speak to ourselves. And really the opportunity for me is our ability to project ourselves into the business sector, really to guide their own balance sheets, because what we know is economically really valuable information about how a company manages its sea level risk or its risks to water availability, or if it's working in agriculture or marine resources. All those things are in flux, just as Heriberto was mentioning a half an hour ago or an hour ago. So to me, that's just really unexploited territory, because it really brings together these two communities that have been keeping themselves at arm's length for a while. And I feel optimistic for several reasons. One is that actually there was a news piece in Bloomberg 2 days ago that now 400 plus companies worth a combined revenue of $8 trillion are basically budgeting in their own account books the cost of carbon and how that's going to impact their balance sheets. This is not paying any attention to something coming from central government or coming from our, from U.S. leadership. So what's great is that I think we, meaning the scientists and the business community, the finance community, can just do an end run around whatever Congress or the United States government wants to do, because in a way that's irrelevant. What's relevant is what's the solution for the future. And if you're a company, if you're running a big company, you want to know what your risk portfolio is. And climate is a big part of that. Some of you may know that S&P now includes climate risk as part of your credit rating if you're a large company. So there are some real handles. And again, just to finish off the thought, a big point of encouragement on my part is that I've been having discussions with the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, and John Danilovich, who's actually been in this group before, who's the Secretary General of that organization. They represent 6.5 million businesses, and they came to us. And so I really feel like there's this sort of growing sense of frustration about waiting for leadership from the government, and really a sense of action that's coming from corporate finance and corporations.
So, Heriberto, and then your questions.
Yes, well, it's the culture is changing. The culture is changing. Mm-hmm. And I will point out that many major corporations have director-level officers in charge of sustainability, whose job it is to make that something is done about sustainability. And that factors into their job evaluations, et cetera, et cetera. Right. That includes outfits like Procter & Gamble, for instance. We have a collaboration with them. And they have a director in charge of sustainability. This is a company that has somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 billion customers across the planet. So even a small environmental improvement times 3 billion, it's a lot. Yeah. So it's changing. The question in my mind is it happening fast enough?
Right.
That's the only question I have. But is the cultural narrative being created? Yes, it's happening. Is the culture changing? Yes, it is. But is it happening fast enough? And
in some ways, that's probably an unanswerable question.
I don't have an answer to the question, maybe, because it's unanswerable.
Okay, so your questions now. Maybe some of them are answerable.
Somebody should change the lights to show the...
You're going to have to raise your hand and wave it so we can see. Over here? I think there's a... Oh, yeah, and then over there.
Yep.
So you and then you?
One thing that has been proposed in response to the revelations about Exxon's cover-up of the science that they knew back in the 1970s and 80s is to sue them under the RICO statutes. I wonder if some of your panelists could respond to that and how we might prevent them from lobbying both Congress and the UN at the climate negotiations and treat them the way the tobacco industry was treated.
Well, this gets, I've been digging in on that question. I'll just say briefly, well, you know, the action could be taken, but they could actually, if you look carefully at their documents and their statements, there isn't a huge gap between what they said and what they knew at the time. When you look carefully, they probably could argue that through the end of time, even under RICO prosecution. So I wouldn't count on that leading anywhere in a hurry. But then again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try it. There was a woman back there, and then right here.
Thank you.
I kind of cut you all off on that, but I think...
So most of the strategies described here today are sort of top-down approaches that are done by the governments. In your opinion, is there something that can be done from the consumer basis? Is there something that the individuals can do, and if it gains momentum in terms of individual choices? Because, for example, it's an open secret that factory farming and animal agriculture and factory fishing is the leading cause of deforestation and methane and greenhouse emissions. What is your opinion on that, and where's the debate about personal choice and personal choices that we could be making to mitigate what's happening?
The change in values is going to be coming from people. It's not going to come top down. And as pointed out, it is critical. Let me give you one example that is not usually discussed. Stop eating meat. Between 18 and 25% of the CO2 emissions come from the production, transportation, distribution. And these are our friends. These are our colleagues. We have no business going around killing these animals and eating them when we can eat so many other... I'm just one vegetarian, but I just give you one example. There is many others, and what was mentioned about RICO and what was mentioned by Andrew as well, using the laws, etc., are very important. And because it is values, it has to come from people. Am I wrong?
If you both agree,
said by an Argentinian.
Yes, I'm very impressed. An Argentinian says you should stop eating meat.
I actually stopped eating meat when I was 13, and indeed, being Argentinian, it was crazy. You had to stand up to an unbelievable cultural bias.
Patriotic.
Yes. But the cows are my favorite, and followed by the don't eat, how do you say, pig, don't eat...
Pork.
Not pork, what you put in egg, bacon. Don't eat bacon. I mean, these are our friends. They're very intelligent, very nice animals.
Okay.
I'll let it go.
I think I said here, and then you.
I was just writing this question. In terms of this divestment from fossil fuel, you're never going to build any renewables without a lot of fossil fuels. So we're sort of not working with the people that are necessary to transform an economy the size of our global economy. And so we, the people, need to steer the economy, is the analogy I use, but we also need the economic pedal to go in the direction once we steer it. And I want to sort of talk about I think we should go back to the private enterprise and the wealth that has so much capital at risk of severe destruction in the next century, that we need their money to just be directed in the right way. And how do we sort of get everyone to the table without incriminating anyone to sort of put it in the right direction? I just want to hear that.
Yeah, I'll answer it really quickly. I mean, so some of you may have known that in 2013, a very big revolution took place. And it was the first year when there was more energy created from renewables, new energy added to the global grid from renewables than from fossil fuels. And that's an irreversible change. You know, that transition, that crossover point, is sometimes referred to as grid parity. We crossed grid parity 2 years ago. That is a huge global landmark. And so the ability for renewables to come in and actually provide a reasonable component of our energy needs is, we're just beginning to see that ramp up, in my opinion. I do think that we need to take a very hard look at what carbon emissions mean to human sustainability, but there's a parallel story here, which is that there's a lot of money to be made for whoever's going to be the next Henry Ford of solar, or whatever, pick your person. But I think there's a remarkable financial opportunity there for someone who's able to seize upon it.
Very, very quickly, I just want to be able to fit in at least one or two more questions.
Well, I'll speak quickly. I agree that, the trend is towards more use of renewables. However, you have to be careful because renewables, what you have to do to produce renewable energy is not free of environmental impacts. So you also have to think in terms of meeting people's needs with lower per capita consumption of energy.
For sure. Right. Energy services are the thing to measure, right? Especially in developing countries where there's such an unmet need for even a little energy. Was there, you and then here. Maybe if we could get the two questions on the floor, and that way we can have sort of close out with a good discussion right to the end. Am I missing anyone over in that side of the room? Okay, those two.
So what I'm wondering about is we've heard discussion about the mechanisms we might engage with to create change. One being the political mechanism, the other being sort of market-based solutions. And then reference was made to the Pope's encyclical and the introduction of the idea that there's a moral mechanism, that you could tweak dials with the moral argument as well. But I worry that we don't have good institutions or systems or laws or moral structures that deal with action at distance, which is what the climate, our actions and the climate system have to do. They're very much action at distance, not like murder or theft where it's two individuals. So do any of you know of anyone working on building structures or institutions or bodies that can try to change the culture through this sort of understanding action at a distance, so that the Kit Kat bar and the orangutan, or carbon emissions and conflict across the planet?
There was someone, there was a woman at a university, her name's Knappenberger or something like that. A few years ago I wrote about, she proposed that we need a legal guardian for the future. Basically a representative for future generations. Yes. So there are people, and that's just one experiment. People are trying to figure out things like that.
There is a society in England called a Heritage Society, which does exactly that. Represents the property rights of the future.
There you go. And Ecuador, there's some countries in their constitutions they've added components like that. So it's challenging though. So you? Yep.
Thank you. I've been frantically writing along with everything you said. And I had a question. I am partly one of those communicators, and I'm working on bringing these stories into mainstream media. And I wonder, I do think that those fantastic, like global thermostat and those engineering solutions and innovation, that's fantastic to talk about. And I think that fuels new values as well, because it gives hope, Then people are like, okay, we can do it, so let's do it. And so my question was, that is definitely a story that needs to get out. Are there other of those fantastic innovations and solutions that are ready and that people need to know about? And I also had a small question, like if we all stop eating meat, is that enough? Is that like the amount of reduction that would already do it, or do we need more? Is 25% enough?
So, yeah, and I'd like you each, now's the time to, as you frame responses here, think about an overall going away, take home point, takeaway point.
Yeah, so if I were to offer my own vision for the futures, I think hope and inspiration has to be our message for the future. It cannot be one of doom and despair, which is the message we've been playing up to this point. And I think the way that we can speak to that is by coming up with realistic changes, realistic technologies. There's going to be a lot of money put forward, and some people are going to win, some people are going to lose. There are other technologies that I think some competition would be worthwhile. In particular, I think this is something worthy of X Prize investment, or what they once had as the Queen's Prize for the best chronometer. We ought to be funding that same level of discovery and innovation to solve these problems, because really bringing the world's best scientists and innovators is what's going to fuel this planet. In fact, if you look at the global economic growth, it was driven almost exclusively by science and technology. And so climate is going to act like a real tax on that productivity, that prosperity. And so the ability to turn these great minds toward things that will enhance our sustainability, to me, is a real opportunity. Sorry? Do you have any examples? Yeah, so we actually have 3 people at Columbia, now 2, but Graciela and her partner have Global Thermostat. There's another person in my department, Peter Kellerman, who's reacting CO2 with a rock type that forms a crystal, forms actual calcite. So you actually turn gaseous CO2 to a solid mineral. And then we have another person who's actually developed a way to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we're not alone in this. But these people, I think, should be having levels of investment that reflect the importance of the work that they're doing.
And they don't, those levels of investment don't exist. As a matter of fact, here it is. The state, the US government has not invested 1 cent in any research funding for the area of direct removal of carbon from the atmosphere, because it's considered to be revolutionary. And they invest in the things that are more, But we need revolutionary technology, so we had to change that. So what we're thinking is to have crowdfunding and to offer franchises, so whoever has an idea about how to pursue this technology can be crowdfunded and use it practically, obtain a franchise. And if you want to use our technology and deploy it for a certain application that is particularly important to you, we will crowdfund for you, and we will do it. And we are devising a global thermostat prize to encourage global use of the technology, not just by one company, but just globally. And by the way, I interrupted Heriberto, so my apologies. It was your turn.
Well, that means you get the final.
I am pleased to be last.
Yeah.
Okay, I get the last word.
Yes, exactly.
Literally. The solution to these problems is going to be multifaceted. If you tell people don't eat meat, it's not going to happen. They will eat some meat. But if you say, well, reduce your meat consumption, that's possible. So we're going to have to say, all right, reduce meat consumption. Capture as much CO2 as you possibly can. You're not going to capture all of it, but you work at it. Reduce your use of energy. Can you meet your needs by using less energy? I mean, can I start building houses that require less air conditioning? If you use energy, can you use renewable energy rather than petroleum-based energy, fossil fuel-based energy? We will always have some energy generated from fossil fuels. The question is how much.
Yes, I agree totally.
And if we can drop all these things to the right level, yes, we will have the result, and we don't have to have a meat police looking into people's kitchens to see if they are cooking beef or not. The question is, can you reduce all these things to a manageable level? And it's multifaceted. It's not one thing, it's many.
And boosting resilience to climate hazards in the meantime, and developing more resilient coastlines, because those things are not going away. The vulnerability is there in rich and poor countries. Well, this was a great discussion. On .earth, I'll be writing about this. I write about this issue all the time. So just Google for any of the names here, and you'll see more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.